So the first question is from Owen. He'd like to know what water security means, what it's all about. Basically, water security is talking about the ability of a place to have enough water to sustain its population. Like any resource, there's a balance to be achieved between having the low enough demand and a high enough supply, both of which have challenges in being met. If we take supply side and demand side in turn, we can see how they affect water security in a given place. So first of all, the amount of rainfall is the primary indicator of a water supply. In other parts of the world, this is linked to other factors. So in the Himalayas, for example, the glacial meltwater feeds the rivers to the south, into India and Bangladesh. There's about 1.9 billion people who get their drinking water from glacial meltwater. But let's take the UK because we're reasonably familiar with its geography and we're familiar with kind of what it's like here. And there's a clear distinction looking at the areas which have access to water and the areas which have the most amount of rainfall. So in the south and east of the UK, there is significantly less rainfall than there is in the north and west. And this in effect mirrors the population. So in the UK, the population is centred around the south and east, around London, with fewer people living in the furthest north and the furthest west that you go. This means the UK's got a surplus of water in those small populations in the north and west, with fewer people living there and more water to be shared around those fewer people. On the other hand, there are more people in the south and in the east, but less water to go around those populations. So that's an area that we would describe as having a water deficit. In effect then, what we've got are two states of water security. Somewhere that is secure, that has enough water to go around, and somewhere that is insecure, doesn't have enough water to go around. There's degrees within this, obviously. It may be that somewhere has such an abundant supply of water, they can transfer that water elsewhere. But it may be also, as in the UK, that there is a variation in water through the year, through the seasons, or even from year to year as climate dictates. So a country like the UK could swing relatively from periods of water surplus, where there's lots of water available, to periods of water deficit, where there is less water available. And we're in a transition period currently in May-June 2020, where we've got less water than we would like to have in the system, and so there is measures being taken, which we'll talk about shortly, about dealing with a lower water supply. So water companies, which are private companies, have a resource to protect. They have to protect the amount of water that they've got so that they can fulfil the demand from customers. In a period of drought like we're coming into now, they ask for the demand to fall. And they do that in a number of ways. Some of them are kind of advisory and some of them are enforceable. So typically, as we've seen over the last week or so, water companies have advised people to avoid using hose pipes, avoid filling paddling pools, avoid washing the car, to limit the kind of most wasteful uses of water that we have. That can be followed up by, or supplemented by, asking industry to scale back on their use of water, slow down production to reduce the demand on the water supply system. I think at the moment there's a particular water supply issue. The reservoirs are reasonably full, but because people are at home more and using water more freely, the amount of water in the system is being generated, or the demand that's being generated is so much that the filtration systems and the kind of supply side of it isn't well enough fitted to deal with that demand. This May just gone is actually the driest May for 124 years in England. This is some information I found out very recently, and actually what we would expect to find next is legal limits on the use of water. So the dreaded hosepipe ban would be something that may be an action taken, where there would be civil enforcement if you were caught using a hose pipe. And that tends to follow when reservoir levels and river levels fall below a certain level. The UK is nonetheless relatively secure at present in terms of its supply of water, at least in comparison to many less fortunate parts of the world. As a developed economy, we can have transfer provisions to move water around. So areas of surplus in, for example, the Lake District in North Wales can have their water moved to areas where it's needed. So cities like Birmingham and Manchester get their water from lakes in the Lake District and in North Wales. London poses a much bigger and more distinct problem. It sits at the heart of the driest region, as we mentioned earlier, and it hasn't got those kind of hillier, wetter regions nearby. So Thames Water is the most kind of expensive water company to run. They spend more money than any other water board in the UK on fixing leaky pipes, on wastewater recycling, and they've gone as far as to spend £250 million on the UK's only desalination plant. And what that does is take brackish or slightly salty water from the Thames estuary and process that so it can be used for drinking water. In that way, that water company are managing the supply side while customers manage the demand. So Luke wants to know, what is the best renewable energy? Renewable energies all have benefits and drawbacks. They all have things that aren't so good about them, as well as compelling selling point. But that dictates that there's no one source of energy that's a panacea, that's appropriate in every situation, in every country and everywhere around the world. It's true that some of them are more reliable or more efficient or cheaper or easier to install, but they're not all necessarily the same one energy product. So what I thought I'd do, rather than kind of giving you a definitive answer, I'll give you some information, I'll let you make up your own mind about a number of different sources, and then I'll tell you what I think at the end. The most efficient and most reliable source of renewable energy is geothermal energy. It uses the heat from the Earth's mantle, where that is close to the surface, where the crust is thin, to heat water using that natural thermal energy, and is very, very effective, very, very reliable. Very small changes in temperature that wouldn't affect the performance of a thermal power plant using geothermal energy. And so places like Iceland are at the forefront of this technology. There's actually potential in Iceland to export energy to countries like the UK. At the minute, they're only harnessing a fraction of the energy that they could be from geothermal sources under the ground there. Geothermal energy is never going to run out, certainly not in human lifetimes. It's entirely free of emissions. There are zero emissions from producing geothermal energy. It's just water vapour that's the only gas that's released, and the water used in the process can actually be recycled anyway, either pumped back down underground to be heated again, which means it's more thermally efficient because there's less heating having to happen each time, or it can be used for district heating, where the hot water is piped through a town, and rather than somebody having a boiler in their kitchen like I have in the corner of my kitchen, or there's a municipal supply of hot water. You can read more about geothermal energy at one of the links in the description below. There is one problem with geothermal energy, and that's that it's not feasible in many places on the planet. So I've mentioned Iceland. That's one of the few places on the planet where it is scalable as an energy source. So a more popular source of renewable power would be solar. Certainly for homes and small businesses, can very easily install a solar cell on the roof of a building, on a garage, on a cycle store, on top of a street light, on top of a bus shelter, you name it, you can put a solar panel anywhere. There's around about, and the numbers differ depending on where you look, but there's around about 13,000 megawatts of solar panel production, energy production in the UK, which is, from what I can calculate, about the same as 25 or 26 traditional coal-fired power stations. So it's a significant proportion now of the UK's energy mix. According to the International Energy Agency, solar could surpass fossil fuels, wind and hydro, by 2050 to become the world's biggest source of power. That might not apply in the UK, where it's more difficult to scale up because we have such variable weather, we have such unreliable weather, and that means that we can't rely on solar power to produce in large quantities that we need in the same way that somewhere in Spain or the Sahara Desert, for example, would be able to. We also, in this country, would need to use a lot of land for solar panels that currently is farmland. So there is a lot of community conflict between the use of land for agriculture, for recreation, and for solar farms as well. The UK is a global leader in both offshore and onshore wind energy though. And in the UK, it accounts for about 16 million homes equivalent of energy that we produce. Both onshore and onshore work in the same way. Big turbine on top of a pole with fins that turn around and rotate, and that generates the power. The difference is that onshore turbines are on land. They're the ones that you'd see around places like Gilmorton as you go down the A14 towards Kettering, or if you're on the way to Swinford, somewhere like that. Offshore farms are located in the sea, so they're much bigger turbines, they're much bigger towers, they're more expensive, but they do output far more energy and actually are a little bit more reliable because of the way that wind moves over the ocean. The UK is a world leader in offshore wind. We've got more installed capacity than any other country. According to Renewables UK, offshore wind alone is the equivalent of 4.5 million homes, and by the end of this year we should have about 10% of the UK's energy mix coming from offshore wind. The cost has fallen by half since 2015, so there's been a big push over the last 5 years to invest in wind power, to have more wind power installed in the UK. It's cheaper than gas and it's cheaper than nuclear power, so it's some of those older technologies are being phased out in favour of wind as well. The other benefit of wind farms is they're less demanding on land. The footprint of a wind turbine on the ground is much less than the equivalent footprint needed to produce the same amount of energy from solar power. So on balance, my view would be that wind power is the best renewable energy choice for the UK, based on the evidence that I've researched. Now, it's obviously not up to me to make the decision. It would be up to you to come up with that by yourself. So there's another link in the description below so you can have a look at some information on wind power as well. You could compare that to the link about geothermal. You could have a look at solar. There's some other things you might want to look at as well. So you could look at biomass, you could look at some of the technology that's changing with nuclear power as well. Remember, nuclear power is not renewable, but it doesn't release carbon dioxide emissions, it doesn't release greenhouse gases, and there's some really interesting stuff happening with small scale nuclear power in particular that came up about 5 or 6 years ago that's well worth looking at. So go and have a read more. It's changing all the time, it's always in the news, so it's an area of geography that's very current, that's really interesting. Do go and have another look at that. So thanks Owen and Luke for your questions. Thanks so much for getting involved with my FAQs, and I'll see you again next time.